So for luck, let me first put on my my headset for the silent session here. I'll do that and I'll be with you straight away. So, well, welcome to this session towards quality and green infrastructure, and I'm extremely pleased to be with you here today. And it's an extremely important topic, and first of all, I'm very, very pleased that we have an excellent panel here with us. And I think to start with, I would like to invite the panel up onto the stage with me, and therefore I'm calling on Chantal Marijnissen, Head of Unit for Environment and Sustainable Natural Resources at the Commission, to please come up. Then also Mr. Christian Kremer from KfW Development Bank, where he's a member of the Management Committee and Regional Director for Latin America and Policies. Then Mr. Nick O'Regan, Director of Implementation Practices and Standards at UNOPS, and last but not least, Mr. Werner Schmidt from the European Investment Bank, Director of the Urban and Territorial Development Department. Now, I'll just make some very brief framing remarks before we head straight to discussion, but as I mentioned, the topic is extremely important because development requires huge infrastructure investments. And it's not only that, it's also that decisions that are being made now about the infrastructure that is being chosen is going to have implications for decades to come, because the life cycle of infrastructure assets is just not something that's, can be changed or would go away after a couple of years. But it's really with us for 30, 50, sometimes 100 years. So there is a key risk of lock-in of infrastructure that's actually not suited to sustainability, and that comes to the second part of the equation, which is that we are facing a global climate and biodiversity crisis, and basically that crisis required a sustainable approach and a joint approach by all development actors. Now, that makes strategic planning absolutely essential, and at the same time it also means that you need to bridge, on the one hand, the infrastructure challenge and the green challenge, so to speak, because you need the infrastructure for development, but you don't achieve and you don't sustain the development unless you can make it green and contribute to the transformation. So that's basically the context in which we're having this discussion here. And then we're really looking forward to, hopefully getting very interesting insights from our panel on, things like the use of nature-based solutions, what kind of transport solutions to choose, and also how to frame the long-term planning processes that will be essential for defining the outcomes. So let us now jump directly into the panel. And let me start with Chantal. So as I've just said, development is not possible basically without huge infrastructure investments. And the aim of the Global Gateway is basically to help achieve this development and to do it in a green way. Now, from the Commission perspective, Chantal, what do you see actually as the biggest challenge for achieving the scaling up of infrastructure and infrastructure that is green? And how will the Global Gateway address that challenge?
Thank you, Jens. From the Commission side, we're looking at different, obviously, policy documents that we have to implement. We've got the Global Gateway and we've got the Green Deal. For us, the Global Gateway is the projection of the Green Deal worldwide. It's the way that we will achieve climate neutrality and avoid the destruction of nature beyond Europe. I think that's one of the things that's really important. Now, what we are doing under the Global Gateway is mobilizing 300 billion euros through a Team Europe approach up to 2027 to invest in infrastructure, in digital transformation, in the wider world, to make sure that we are connected to our partners, but in a way that is actually green and climate resilient. what we want to do is respond to the reports from the IPCC and the IPBES that have been showing us that if we don't act now, we're going to be... I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo. We're going to be locking ourselves into a way that's going to not allow us to achieve the goals of the Paris objectives, and that we could actually find ourselves in the next decade actually getting an increase of 1.7 Celsius degrees. So we know that this will be also combined with achieving tipping points that can be really bad for human civilization as we know it. And so if we don't invest in green infrastructure over the next decade, we're going to be locking ourselves out of this transformational pathway. We think that green infrastructure is the way out, and infrastructure can either lock us into a fuel dependency and therefore get us completely off track, or it's one of the ways that we can actually achieve this transformation that would be both good for climate but also for nature. Now, if we're looking at the global gateway, what we want to do is actually transform our investments in infrastructure. We want it to be both environmentally resilient and respectful, but also adhere to social standards. So we think that the two actually go together. They can't be disconnected. And what we want to see is projects that actually live up to the Green Deal commitments and the principle of doing no harm. Now, what I think is very important for us to remember is it's not just principles that we've put down. We've also got financial targets that we need to achieve as the European Union. And these financial targets apply also to our cooperation in other countries, in the wider world, because we strongly believe that Europe can't work on its own. Whatever we do in Europe will have very little impact. We need to be sure that we're working with partners, and therefore we've got a 35% of our investments worldwide need to be in climate actions, actions that will actually help us to combat climate change. But we've also committed to doubling our investment for biodiversity. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be working on protected areas, but it does mean that we will be integrating it into all of the sectors that we're working on now. If we're looking at what we can do with banks, with the financial institutions who are represented here on the panel with me, I think there are several things that we need to look at. First is the EFA Plus. We need to make sure that we're getting a pipeline of projects for infrastructure that are green. And for that to be delivered, we think there needs to be a pipeline of programs, projects that are presented to us, and they can be in renewable energy, they can be in sustainable transport, in clean water and sanitation, in nature-based solutions for coastal areas, but also for water management. And we think that we really need to apply robust environmental and social standards. So impact assessments, all of these tools that we have available. Now, we're not alone as Europeans. We have got investors from Russia and China, and we don't want to be locked into a race to the bottom. We really think it's important for Europe to stick to its standards, to go green, and to show the way on how we can actually do green investments. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Santa. And I think you already cued us on quite a number of points, so I'm sure we'll hear more of that as we go to our next speakers. And with that, let me invite Christian Kramer from KfW. Christian, one key point that has kept coming up is that development banks, as sort of the finance arm of the development world, needs to ensure that their engagement gets greener, and at the same time, I think make sure that there are projects to finance. So, as director for Latin America and for policies, and as a member of the KfW management committee, what is KfW doing about this? And is there anything that you should do more of or somehow differently to your traditional approaches?
Thank you. Sustainability, climate protection, and the environmental and social compatibility of financing are guiding principle for KfW's action. All projects supported by KfW Development Bank are comprehensively and systematically reviewed for the environmental and social impacts in accordance with the international recognized standards. In 2020 and 2021, KfW Development Bank significantly expanded its staff in the area of environmental and social compatibility. Climate impacts and challenges arising from the climate change are constantly taken into account from the outset. To further improve in these climate aspects, we started a major climate mainstreaming process. Climate mainstreaming in KfW does not just mean we calculate and optimize the mitigation potential of projects in the planning process. It is now obligatory for all projects that a climate risk assessment for the specific location of the infrastructure project is undertaken. So that goes for every single project. 2 years ago, the KfW started the implementation of the sustainability finance concept Transform. The concept has 4 pillars. First, systematic matching of all activities to the 17 SDGs for enhancing impact and impact monitoring. Second, Paris compatibility of KfW financing. Third, strengthening environmental and social risk management. And fourth, last but not least, reporting according to the EU taxonomy. Let me give you 2 concrete examples and sectors. First, urban mobility. 100% of the projects are classified as mitigation projects, and it is expected that actual projects under implementation will decrease greenhouse gases by more than 1 billion tons annually. The potential for public transport, walking, cycling and e-mobility projects for decarbonization, the transport sector still is huge. So that's what we think. And another example is the water sector. Construction of wastewater treatment plants in relevant locations can help improve, respectively, protect biodiversity in waters. So giving those 2 examples, public transport and water sector, to give you an idea about the things I just pointed out before generally.
Many thanks, Christian, and including for the concrete examples, I think, which show also that the action for green cuts across so many different sectors and touches on so many issues. But let me then move on to Nick from UNOPS, and UNOPS is a UN agency mandated for infrastructure, basically. You implemented around 1,000 projects each year, and you build infrastructure in some of the most challenging contexts on the planet, such as Yemen, Iraq and Somalia. So, Nick, as a director for implementation practices and standards at UNOPS, what is the main difference that you see between a traditional approach to infrastructure and to green infrastructure, and how is UNOPS translating this into achieving green infrastructure required for sustainable development? Would be great if you could give us a few more examples on that.
Good, thank you very much. Really important question. Well, the traditional approach to infrastructure development is to focus on the cost of construction as the primary driver for the delivery of an asset. And this has typically resulted in an infrastructure solution that is cheap to construct, but very often at the detriment to people and the planet. Now, through research together with the University of Oxford and with UNEP, we found that infrastructure is contributing to 79% of greenhouse gas emissions. and responsible for 88% of adaptation costs. This demonstrates that infrastructure is fundamental to climate action. And the massive infrastructure deficit means that we cannot afford to get it wrong, because infrastructure is expensive and it's built to last. So the decisions we take now can lock in our climate crisis. To move away from this traditional approach, first of all, we need to take this seriously. Secondly, we need to add a green lens to how infrastructure is planned, delivered, and managed to ensure that sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development is at the very center of all the decisions of infrastructure and actions across its entire lifespan. And addressing this infrastructure gap can not only be about channeling funds into assets, there also needs to be investment in the enabling environment that informs the decisions so that the investments are right in terms of sustainability, in terms of green. And we also need to recognize that the natural environment is natural infrastructure. Many ecosystems provide direct and indirect services for society, and by appreciating their potential to complement and support human-made infrastructure, including nature-based solutions for infrastructure services, but also making built infrastructure resilient, can create many more co-benefits. Now, UNOPS delivers infrastructure solutions based on 4 operational pillars: strengthening the enabling environment, prioritizing the right solutions for service delivery, delivering the right solutions well, and maximizing existing system performance. And we have some cutting-edge tools and approaches that are assisting governments across these 4 pillars, including upstream of project implementation. As an example, in Ghana, under the leadership of the Ministry of Environment, we collaborated with the University of Oxford, the Global Commission on Adaptation, and UNEP to quantify for the very first time Ghana's climate adaptation needs across the energy, the water, and the transport sector. And we undertook an assessment of the built, the natural, and the enabling environment to understand the adaptation needs, and then developed a roadmap of priority adaptation investments to address these identified needs. 35 projects were identified across the 3 sectors and across the 3 environments. A couple of examples, if we talk about nature-based solutions, well, one of those was the upstream afforestation of the Volta River reservoir to build resilience to flood and drought. And if we talk about the enabling environment, it included an updating of planning and design processes to prioritize the use of nature-based solutions, as well as green design principles. Also, importantly, we identified potential sources of financing that are aligned to the adaptation projects, and equally important, that would support this lens of green infrastructure. We identified 78 potential sources of financing for the built environment and 58 for the enabling environment. Now, the Global Gateway launched by the EU is a welcome initiative that actually supports this approach, supports this thinking. And we really look forward to supporting the EU in making this a success. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, and great to hear that there's already lots of coordination going on and pulling together towards a common approach. But with that, let me turn to our final speaker, Mr. Werner Schmidt from EIB. And I believe EIB is the biggest development bank in terms of a balance sheet or financing, actually. And as a director of urban and territorial development departments, what do you see as a key factors, Werner, that will shape whether the green infrastructure push will succeed, both in cities and in rural areas outside of them? And how is the EIB zooming in on these factors?
Thank you very much, Jens. And it's a great pleasure to be here today. Now, let me just start. Perhaps we are not only the largest multilateral development bank, but we are financing 90% of our investments within the European Union. But also we are the bank of the EU, of the European Union, of the member states of the EU. And we also, since a few years, the EIB Climate Bank. That means actually climate and green sustainable infrastructure investment is in our name. We are obviously following together with our colleagues in the Commission very closely the European Green Deal. And in recent years, we have made quite some bold policy commitments under, for instance, our energy lending policy to stop unabated fossil fuel financing. We have, under our climate bank roadmap, quite some serious commitments regarding financing towards climate action and environmental sustainability, which should reach 50% by 2025. We are also, our projects are Paris aligned, and we are intending to trigger 1 trillion of investments over the coming decade. And we have just recently set up our new EIB global branch, which should further foster this. Now, key factors in this respect, clearly in many developing countries, but also in the developed world, regulatory uncertainty is something which is a key factor impeding investments. But what we also see is the lack of technical capacity in many countries, not only for, as you mentioned, Jens, the strategic planning, but also the project preparation and the implementation, which is something where we also working very closely with the UN agencies to work that. To help there, both within the European Union, the EIB has developed quite some important technical advisory instruments to help, but also outside the Union we have, for instance, with the support of the Luxembourgish and the German government, established the Climate City Gap Fund, which is really trying to get early project preparation financed. As a bank, obviously, another key success factor is the lack of funds and the need for finance. Chantal mentioned the investment needs, which are enormous for the coming years. In this respect, the EIB, we've been a leader and a front runner on the borrowing side. So we've established basically the green bond standards a couple of years ago, where in 2007 we issued the first green bonds, and we have recently also on the borrowing side established the sustainability awareness bonds. Clearly on the lending side, with some 65 billion investment last year on the infrastructure side, we have financed roughly 14 billion in sustainable cities and 15 billion in sustainable energy and natural resources. In this context, let me also join Christian on providing an example for an urban infrastructure finance. In fact, Cairo Metro, since the 90s, we've been supporting the establishment of the urban mobility plan in Cairo. And more recently, we've on sustainable energy side, we have financed Lake Turkana in Kenya, which is the largest wind farm, offsetting some 700,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. So overall, EIB, we try to make an impact, and we can make a real impact with our partners. And with EIB Global, the new branch, I think we are even better placed to prepare the grounds for the needs of our customers. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Werner, for these remarks. Now, we've gone through our first round and heard some very interesting points. We heard from Chantal how the basically Green Gateway is linked to the Green Deal, the aim of mobilizing. What I retained was sort of avoiding locking ourselves out of the transformation that's required to achieve sustainable development. We heard also from Christian, the focus on climate mainstreaming, not just on the planning side, but integrating climate into the financials with climate risk assessments and the climate standards, etc. Also, the point I think that it goes together with a focus on SDGs, that climate and development basically go hand in hand together. We heard from Nick also very much the points on the enabling environment, the points of the natural environment that also provides natural infrastructure, and I think also what I sort of where my brain clicked was this the focus on infrastructure, not in terms of the assets but of the service delivery point, I think. And then finally we heard very much how we need to unlock massive amounts of investments. Great to hear the ambition of the EIB of unlocking 1 trillion. but again, the focus on the regulatory constraints, the policy environment, which is not just also not just an issue of the actual regulatory and policy settings, but also just the capacity to implement and provide everything around that. So very rich discussions. With this, I would like to open it up to the floor for some interventions and questions. Maybe a quick question to which the panel could respond, or also quick comment or statement if you have that. So let me see if anybody would like to come in at this point from the floor. Yes, please. And please introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Rahul. I'm the Programme Manager for the Transport and Connectivity Strategy Group at the Africa-Europe Foundation. So I'd like to just bring in a couple of points from our work, specifically from the African side. So firstly, I think we've heard a lot about transport infrastructures and urban mobility, but I think one of the things I was listening to this morning in a conversation was the need for multimodal approaches to corridors, especially. And one of the things the African Union's doing is incorporating the maritime leg of these corridors within its approaches to corridors. And I think this is something that can reduce a lot of, or can have a much greener impact in the transport sector, just because of freight, and maritime freight is much less carbon intensive than road freight. And now linking this to infrastructure investment is the JRC has identified a few strategic corridors in Africa, but they match inland water routes. We're advocating for inland water transport to be scaled up on the African continent. And for example, there's corridors identified along the River Nile, along Lake Volta, that could be done by barges instead of by trucks. But one of the issues is, and this is again something all the panelists have addressed, is the need for projects. We hear it all the time with infrastructure that there's plenty of money but no projects. So perhaps it's bankability studies, perhaps it's feasibility studies. I know the AFDB have got a facility specifically for funding these studies. Maybe more of them is going to be what's necessary. And the very, very last thing, I'll be very quick. Something from our Citizens Platform Debate in Africa. One of the things that one of our contributors raised was the need for these in cities, especially, is because of the air quality and a lot of them, and reducing truck volume going to cities is absolutely crucial. And that's why, like, putting as much in port management and port infrastructures is going to be crucial to this. But the other thing that's not really been spoke about, and I wasn't going to bring it up, but because the natural environment can be considered a natural infrastructure, public housing, I would argue, by that same logic, is part of a public infrastructure. When we consider new transport routes, when we consider new housing projects, these should be incorporated in planning. Thanks.
Many thanks for these comments, and the focus around transport, the question of a multimodal approach and corridors, and the basic question around the money and the projects, the chicken and the egg, basically. Is it the pipeline? Is it the financing? We'll come back to that, but let's see if there are more questions from the floor. Yes, here in front I have... Oh, okay, we can go first there, and then we come back to the gentleman in front here. So please also introduce yourself first.
Okay, thank you, Alan Asimwe, Trademark East Africa. We deal with trade and transport corridors. A quick one, and we're looking at the design now of infrastructure and the design that we propose with green systems. I think one of the challenges we are facing as we work with governments is showing the incentives. Why should we do it green? Isn't it more expensive? You did it different in Europe. Why don't we do it the way you did it, with industrialization, pushing, the boundaries? So that's a very big one, and it would be interesting to know from the big financiers what kind of arguments you're using as you engage with governments, because it's a big discussion as they have many priorities to take. Do we go green, or do we do it, have you been doing it to ensure that we get our populations growing and all that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the key question, what about the money? Is it more expensive, and how to deal with that? And I think that'll be an interesting one to answer. But let me see. I think I saw another question up in front here. So please, again, if you could introduce yourself and then pose a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Eric Karerangabo from Rwanda Green Fund. I just want to make a contribution, and I would extend my appreciation to the rich discussions from the panelists. So the UN General Assembly recently adopted the Doha Program of Action that states that least developed countries are facing quality infrastructure gap. And if you look at most of the least developed countries, they have been affected by the effect of climate change. Now we are discussing about the green infrastructure. I want to share some practical initiative that can be taken to the discussion also. I want to take the case of Rwanda. So there is a study which was carried out to assess the economic impact of climate change countrywide. And the study findings demonstrated that there is a loss of GDP of 1% on annual. And that has waked up the government, excuse me, that the findings has awakened the government to open eyes and take action on how to come to green path. So there is a green growth strategy which was developed, and it informed the establishment of Rwanda Green Fund. The Rwanda Green Fund has been supporting on green infrastructure from the local solutions which were coming from the private sector, coming from public institutions, and sometimes coming from the civil societies to support the green growth path. And there is a new project which we call Green Kigali Project, which is supported by KfW. It's a green city project, the first in Rwanda, which will mainstream on how to go to the journey of greening the infrastructure countrywide. Coming back to the challenges that faced by the least developed country, actually there are two things that I can share. One is mainstreaming environment and climate change into policies and programs and plans. There is a need to sensitize and mobilize on that aspect. Secondary is to establish climate finance mechanism in the countries so that it becomes easy for accessing those funds to implement those initiatives. So that's what I wanted to share during this session. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. So I think we probably don't have time to take another question, but I would like to pass it, back to the panel now. And just to recall quickly, I mean, first the focus on transport questions, the corridors and the multimodal approach. Then the question around finance, what is the cost? Is there an extra cost? How to deal with that? How to approach with that? And then I think interestingly, the counterpart side, that actually not taking action has a very direct cost on the GDP, but then the challenges of actually being able to mainstream this into policies, into programs, and being able to access finance for that. So who would like to volunteer to go first? Otherwise we could just offer to go around the panel. But anybody who would like to jump in on any of those questions? Yes, please, Christian.
Yes, thank you. I have to refer to the question how to find bankable projects. And I would like to bring one aspect in the discussion, and that is the aspect of digitalization and data. How do you do good projects? By using good data. And I think that's one of the main reasons, and that's a main key in order to work on project finance, in order to improve project finance, in order to find projects that are more bankable because they mirror a certain data. And therefore, I think the digitalization means a certain boost for this sector. Just to bring this aspect in.
Many thanks. So I see we have also Werner coming in, please.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the questions. I couldn't agree more with regard to the multimodal view of which needs to be taken. Let me just add one point on the public housing side and social and affordable housing also in the developing countries. A model which is very practiced in the developed world, and the planning. This is a key component. I fully agree with the discussant, and in fact we will be discussing this next week in the World Urban Forum with colleagues from UN in Katowice. Last point on the incentives, the question from the lady, and I think our colleague from Rwanda has almost answered the question to demonstrate a 1% GDP loss actually and makes the government understand. And then obviously the financiers also have their role to play. They can look at those projects which contribute in particular and then finance and provide attractive finance to these projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nick?
Yep, thank you very much. Maybe just to cut across a few of them is you know, there's this paradox that exists that investors are saying that there's not enough good projects out there. And there's governments that are saying that there's not enough investment out there. And frankly, this isn't going to be addressed until we start investing more in the enabling environment that I was talking about. And that is what's going to deprioritize the environment to attract more financing, good governance, and good regulatory environment, including more favorable PPP policies. This is what's going to be needed. Better matching of projects to relevant funds. And once they're matched, projects that are better prepared, that are shovel-ready, that have the technical, legal, and financial feasibility study to confirm this readiness and the potential bankability. The more public money we put into projects, the less that is going into the enabling environment, and we will create this vicious circle of not attracting the private sector financing that's going to be required to go to scale, to deliver the infrastructure that's required, especially across Africa and in those places where it's needed most. Thank you.
Many thanks, Nick. And last but not least, Chantal, please.
And maybe I can bounce off what Nick was saying. I think this is where the European Union can come in through our delegations on the environment, the policy environment. I think we need to look at also what exists in partner countries to see if there aren't negative incentives for certain types of infrastructure. And we need to be having dialogues with partner governments to get the right incentive in place. It's also, you know, part of the good governance. We need to make sure that when there's infrastructure investment and PPPs, if they do exist, in some cases they do, that the partners feel secure as well in their investments, that there's not going to be something dreadful happening to it. So that's the other aspect, is the governance aspect that we really do need to be looking into. Obviously, the multimodal, and one of the examples of the transport on the Nile is something that we're looking at and that we're very interested in. And I've got my colleague Paolo, who's in charge of our infrastructure and cities unit, and the two of us are sort of looking at it from the different perspectives, because I look at the water and the waterways, and Paolo looks at the infrastructure, and we try and bring in, you know, and combine forces. I think water and waste management is a very important one, and coastal infrastructure and how we can bring in nature-based solutions, something that I didn't mention, that we do look at through different programs, where we also look at what we can do with grants to then create the enabling environment for the financial institutions to be able to come in with the guarantees and the blending operations to then, you know, make it really concrete. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks. I think fascinating range of answers, and I'm sure we could continue much more, but unfortunately our time is limited. So I'll just end with a few words. By no means a comprehensive summary, but I think some of the key takeaways for me were really that as we were discussing this infrastructure question, I think what came out very much was it is about development, and the development is only possible if it's green and sustainable. But I think that point also needs to be made clear that there are the benefits. It's not asking developing countries to assume an additional cost, but that it's very much in their own development interest, and that they'll get the help to achieve that. And I think that's a key point. We heard that there's lots of ambition, lots of financing coming from the EU and others. At the same time, the needs are enormous. I think if we just think about the energy sector, the IEA estimated that there needs to be a 7-fold increase to energy investments in developing countries to 1 trillion per year. So the scale is absolutely staggering compared to what it was before. It needs to be 7 times what it has been over the last years. And that brings, I think, brings the discussion to the point very much of the enabling environment, both on the sort of policy and regulatory side, but also in terms on the capacity side and the ability, to just do the project preparation and provide for everything that is written down and use the data actually to create the projects. But fundamentally, a lot of that again is just what are the basic development constraints that countries face. It's particular and it's essential in the climate context, but it's also essential for the broader development needs and aspirations of those countries. And I would maybe also end with saying that as there's a development process taking place, the financial deepening in itself will play a very big role in the ability to access financing and grow the financing pie. So as I said, these were just a few takeaways that I had from the discussions. I would like to thank our panel very much for their contributions. This is a silent meeting, but I would like to invite the audience to give them a good hand of applause. And I would close with wishing them, in the interest of us all, the best of luck and best of success with taking the ambitious plans forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jens. Thank you very much to your panel. Thank you for those very insightful contribution. I think we all owe it to ourselves, to our planet, and of course to the posterity to do everything we can to protect this beautiful home we call our planet. And in the next 10 minutes, we'll be having another session on geopolitics and global gateway. I don't think you want to miss out on this. Please stay around, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.
Hello, anybody there?